On a cold November evening in 1957, a police team enters a deserted farmhouse in Plainfield, a small town in Wisconsin. As the flickering light of their flashlight sweeps across the walls, the scene they encounter resembles a nightmare. A headless female corpse hangs upside down from the ceiling, and objects made from human bodies are scattered around. The heavy air in the room was thick with the stench of rotting flesh and death. While searching for a missing woman, the police stumbled upon a real crime scene that had become a house of horror. This scene is not from a horror movie set, but an actual event. And the person at the center of all this horror is none other than Ed Gein, known for years by the townspeople as a strange but harmless individual. Edward Theodore Edge was born on August 27, 1906, in La Crosse, Wisconsin. His family consisted of 4 people. George Gein, an alcoholic and weak-willed father, was the son of Augusta Gann, an overly religious and oppressive mother. Augusta was a fanatically devout Lutheran who preached to her sons that the world was full of evil, that drinking alcohol was a grave sin, and that all women except herself were instruments of the devil, sinful beings. Every afternoon she would read passages from the Bible to Ed and his brother Henry, particularly from the Old Testament and the Book of Revelation. She tried to shape their upbringing with verses themed around death, punishment, and divine wrath. It is even said that when Ed and Henry were children, Augusta made them swear that they would remain chaste for the rest of their lives, meaning they would never engage in sexual relations. The shadow of their mother, Augusta, covered Ed Gein's entire childhood and worldview. Augusta hated her husband. However, she continued her marriage because she considered divorce a sin. At this time, she was obsessively focused on protecting her children from the sins of the world. George was a carpenter and potter by trade, but he was an incompetent father who spent most of his income on alcohol. As a result, Augusta closed the grocery store she ran in town and chose a rural isolation away from city life. In 1914, the family moved to a remote farm in Plainfield, Wisconsin. This 155-acre farm served Augusta's desire to isolate herself from the outside world. She kept neighbors and strangers away from the house at all times. She never wanted her sons to be influenced by the immorality of city life. When Ed Gein reached school age, he was only allowed to leave the farm to go to school. At school, he was a quiet and withdrawn child. His classmates and teachers remembered Ed as someone who seemed to talk and laugh to himself, with sudden bursts of meaningless laughter. Additionally, Ed had a drooping left eyelid and a slight speech impediment, and because of these physical characteristics, he was subjected to peer bullying. His mother, Augusta, immediately punished any attempt Ed made to make friends, wanting him to be dependent only on her. Growing up socially isolated, Ed nevertheless excelled in his studies at school, particularly in reading. He dropped out after finishing 8th grade but remained an avid reader. Young Ed spent almost his entire life only with his mother and family. He knew the world only through his mother's strict filter. Ed practically idolized his mother, showing absolute obedience to her words. His father, George, was a faint shadow over Ed. When he died in 1940 of heart failure caused by alcoholism, Ed was 34 years old, and this loss did not affect him deeply. Ed Gein's mental world was shaped from childhood by his mother's excessive moral teachings and loneliness. According to psychologists, Ed had developed an abnormally strong dependency on his mother, Augusta. He was bound to her with an almost excessive love. This dependency intensified in the absence of his father and later his brother. When his brother Henry died under suspicious circumstances in a fire on the farm in 1944, Ed's mother became the sole authority figure in his world. Henry's body was found face down after the fire. Although there were no burns on his body, the cause of death was reported as smoke inhalation and heart failure. However, the bruises on Henry's head and Ed's direct guidance of the search party to the body raised suspicions years later that Ed Gein might have been responsible for his brother's death. One writer likened the incident to the biblical story of Cain and Abel, suggesting that Ed's first victim might actually have been his own brother. However, the police did not open an investigation at that time. Henry's death remained recorded as an unfortunate accident in official records. Just 1 year after Henry's death in 1945, Augusta Gein suffered a stroke and died. It was devastating for 39-year-old Ed. He had lost his only friend and true love. He was now completely alone in the world. After his mother's death, Ed, in his own words, was plunged into intense loneliness, not knowing what to do with himself. Ed Gein began to lose his sanity in her absence. He locked up and preserved the rooms Augusta had lived in at the farmhouse. These rooms remained spotless for years. He settled into a small room next to the kitchen and turned the house into a shrine of sorts, keeping his mother's memory alive. During this period, Ed's interests took a dark turn. Living in his own world, isolated from society, Ed Gein began to spend his time reading stories of war and death. He was particularly drawn to books about human experiments conducted in Nazi concentration camps, head-cutting rituals, cannibalism stories, and human anatomy. He devoured cheap horror magazines and violent adventure novels. His sick fantasies about women's bodies and death grew day by day. Gein had never had a normal sexual relationship. He couldn't form close bonds with women in the real world. However, his obsessive thoughts, which combined images of sex and death, became a source of satisfaction. His psychosis, triggered by the loss of his mother, dragged him into an inner world detached from reality. Perhaps driven by a desire to bring his mother back and a perverse fascination with the female body, Ed Gein began to develop increasingly dangerous ideas. Throughout the 1940s, Ed Gein was known in the town as an eccentric but harmless bachelor. Still, looking back, he had some strange behaviors that were chilling. For example, he often babysat the children of neighbors in the area. He found it easier to communicate with children than with adults. It is even said that he once showed a small boy the human skulls he kept hidden in his house. Ed had told the child that these skulls had been sent to him by his soldier cousins who hunted heads in the Pacific Ocean. Although the child told his elders about it, no one took it seriously. They thought it was just a child's imagination. Sometime later, two young people who visited Ed's house also mentioned seeing skulls hanging on the walls. They too thought they were fake decorations for Halloween and didn't think much of it. Over the years, rumors that there were human remains in Ed's house spread like a small urban legend. However, no one believed these rumors until Bernice Worden disappeared. Everyone continued to believe he was a bit eccentric, but completely harmless. In addition, the farm left to Ed by his family was neglected. He himself did not care much about his appearance. Although he sometimes behaved strangely, no one ever seriously suspected him. In 1954, when a woman named Mary Hogan, who ran a tavern in Plainfield, mysteriously disappeared, no one connected her disappearance to Ed Gein. Yet Mary Hogan's disappearance marked the first time Ed Gein's dark secrets came to light. But no one could have known that at the time. Ed was a regular at the tavern Hogan ran, and it would later become clear that he had a physical attraction to her that reminded him of his mother. However, when Mary went missing, the townspeople merely wondered where she had gone. No one suspected that Ed could be responsible for the crime scene at the tavern, with its blood stains and empty shell casings. While the Mary Hogan case remained a cold file, Ed Gein continued to walk around freely. About 10 years after Augusta's death, Ed Gein committed the horrific acts that would go down in history. Ed actually wanted to feel his mother's presence even in her absence. It would later emerge that he had attempted to make a costume resembling his mother out of the bodies of dead women for this purpose. According to Gein's confession, he frequently visited his mother's grave and struggled with the urge to exhume the dead. Finally succumbing to this urge, he began making secret night visits to graveyards starting in 1947. His target was the fresh corpses of middle-aged women resembling his mother. Ed Gein stated that he attempted grave robbery about 40 times, and in 30 of those instances he came to his senses after opening the grave, took nothing, closed the grave, and returned home. However, he confessed to removing bodies from at least 9 graves and taking pieces from them. He skinned the bodies of middle-aged women and preserved the skin. He began making various items from their bones. He even worked with an elderly friend named Gas for this purpose from time to time. It is also alleged that he sought help because he could not dig the grave by himself. Ed Gein carried out all these deviant activities for years without anyone noticing. However, the body parts taken from the graves were not enough after a while. He turned to fresher material, namely living humans. He probably committed his first murder on December 8, 1954. Mary Hogan, a 51-year-old tavern owner in Plainfield, disappeared that day. A pool of blood and empty shells from a .32 caliber pistol were found in Hogan's tavern. Her body was never found for years. Mary Hogan was the complete opposite of Augusta in terms of her behavior and harsh speech. However, physically, she resembled Augusta, being a middle-aged, well-built woman. Ed Gein later confessed to shooting Mary Hogan to death. However, during police interrogations, he claimed not to remember the incident and avoided giving details. His mind seemed to have suppressed these traumatic memories. When Mary Hogan's face and skull were found during a search of Gein's home in 1957, the missing person case from 3 years earlier would finally be solved. The murder of Mary Hogan was the first bloody manifestation of Gein's obsession with bringing back the mother figure in his mind. Ed Gein's second and final victim was 58-year-old Bernice Worden, who disappeared on November 16, 1957. Worden was a widow who worked at the small hardware store she owned in Plainfield. The last customer to visit her store that morning was Ed Gein. He had chatted with her, saying he would buy a gallon of antifreeze. Frank Worden, Bernice's son, who was a deputy sheriff, stopped by his mother's store in the afternoon and found no one inside. There was only an open cash register and bloodstains on the floor. When the missing person report was filed, Frank suspected Ed Gein. This was because Gein was the last person seen in the store the night before his mother disappeared and had said he would return in the morning. Frank Worden noticed that the last receipt in the ledger was for a gallon of antifreeze, so he pointed to Ed and alerted the teams. Bernice Worden's disappearance on November 16, 1957, led to the biggest police investigation in Plainfield's history. Acting on Frank Worden's report, the police quietly arrested Ed Gein at a grocery store in town that same evening. Ed appeared surprisingly calm when arrested. This strange man, who had carried terrible secrets for years, seemed as if he were being taken in for routine questioning. As Gein was taken to the station, Sheriff's Department officers set out for the Gein farm with flashlights and gas lamps. When the police entered Ed Gein's house, the scene they encountered was indescribably horrific. First, the body of Bernice Worden, the person they were looking for, was found in a shed next to the house. Bernice's headless and naked body was hanging from the ceiling like a hunted animal. He was suspended upside down by an iron rod passed through his ankles, his hands tied with ropes. His internal organs had been removed, and it appeared that this procedure had been performed after his death. While this scene alone was sufficiently horrific, what was discovered inside the house was only the beginning. As the investigation of the scene progressed, human remains and a collection of unimaginable items emerged from every corner of Ed Gein's house. According to officials' reports, the horrific items found in the house included the following: human bones. Many human bones and skulls were found, either intact or in pieces. Some human skulls had been mounted on Ed's bedposts for decorative purposes. Household items made from human skin, a trash can, and several chairs were completely covered in human skin. In addition, a lampshade made from a human face hung in the house. Kitchen utensils, bowls, and dishes made from skulls were found. It was understood that these grotesque vessels were used instead of regular cooking pots in the kitchen. Women's costume pieces, a corset made from the skin of a woman's torso, and tights made from human leg skin were found. These costume pieces, sewn by Ed Gein to wear his mother's skin, were a physical manifestation of his obsession. Face masks were made by carefully cutting the skin from various women's faces and shaping them into masks. Among these was Mary Hogan's face. It was found stored inside a paper bag. Mary's skull was also found in a box in a corner of the house. Human organs. 9 female genitalia were found in a shoebox. It was even determined that 2 of them belonged to girls around 15 years old. Rumors also circulated that human organs were found in glass jars in various places around the house. According to official records, there is little information about the organs other than the heart. A piece made from human lips had been used to decorate the cord of a roller blind in one window. A belt made from women's nipples was found. A total of 4 noses, a jar full of human fingernails, and countless other small human remains were reportedly seized from the house. Even this list may fall short of fully conveying the extent of the savagery in the house. According to police photographs and records, these items were documented one by one at the crime scene investigation laboratory and then destroyed in a manner befitting human dignity. These findings painted a picture unprecedented in U.S. criminal history. Ed Gein was in a state of passive surrender when he was arrested the evening Bernice Worden disappeared. When police questioned him, Gein was initially reticent. However, with the crime so obvious, he did not attempt to deny it. In his initial statement, he claimed to have shot Bernice Worden by mistake. He claimed that the rifle he picked up in the store suddenly fired and shot the woman, and that he couldn't remember what happened after that. This, of course, did not reflect the truth, but Gein was trying to rationalize his actions in his mind. As for Mary Hogan, he initially claimed to know nothing about her. However, when Mary's remains were found in his home, he was forced to admit to the murder. Gein confessed to killing both women. However, he claimed he did it while not in his right mind and did not remember the moments of the crimes. An unexpected incident occurred during the interrogations. Waushara County Sheriff Arthur Shelley was so shaken by what he saw in the room and Gein's cold demeanor that he lost control, slammed Ed Gein's skull against the wall, and beat him. Due to this violent incident, it was decided that Gein's initial verbal statement to the police would be deemed invalid in court. Sheriff Shelley died of a heart attack in 1968 at the age of 43 before the trial began. His relatives would say that he never recovered from the scene at Gein's house, that he was, in a sense, a victim of Gein's horror. Indeed, this investigation was so gruesome that it traumatized even the most experienced police officers. After Ed Gein's arrest, the town of Plainfield and the entire country were in shock. The next day, newspaper headlines announced the incident with titles such as "Plainfield's Farm of Horror." Such savagery, hidden for years in a small town, made headlines around the world. Curious crowds gathered in front of the Gein farmhouse. Some wanted to see this house of horrors with their own eyes. One entrepreneur even bought the car Ed Gein used in the murders at auction and displayed it at fairs for a fee as the monster's car. Meanwhile, the authorities were busy with a completely different task: assessing Ed Gein's mental state and bringing him to justice. Ed Gein was first brought to court on November 21, 1957, and was preparing to stand trial on first-degree murder charges. However, at the very beginning of the trial, Ed Gein's lawyers denied the charges, stating that their client was mentally ill. They argued that he was not criminally responsible and therefore not guilty. Psychiatrists appointed by the court examined Gein and diagnosed him with schizophrenia. In a preliminary hearing held in late 1957, it was reported that Ed Gein was paranoid schizophrenic and disconnected from reality. The judge ruled that Gein was unfit to stand trial. As a result, Ed Gein was sent not to prison, but to the Central State Hospital, a high-security mental health institution for the mentally ill in Wisconsin. Thus, the trial process was suspended indefinitely. Ed Gein was no longer behind bars, but was held in a locked psychiatric ward. Ed Gein remained in the mental hospital for exactly 11 years. During this time, doctors tried to observe and treat him. By 1968, Gein was in his early 60s and had become relatively calm after years of treatment. When hospital doctors reported that he had regained the mental capacity to understand the trial and cooperate with his lawyers, the case was reopened. In November 1968, Ed Gein was brought back to court to be tried by Wisconsin authorities. Due to intense public interest, Ed Gein's trial was held without a jury at the request of his defense attorneys. Only the judge presided over the case. During the trial, a psychiatrist testified that Ed had told him the killing of Bernice Worden could have been an accident. He claimed he had accidentally touched the trigger while examining the rifle, and it had fired. He had said this before. However, all the evidence pointed to it being a premeditated murder. After a week-long trial, the judge found Ed Gein guilty of first-degree murder. Immediately afterwards, in a second phase of the trial, Gein's criminal responsibility was reassessed. After cross-examination by psychiatrists, the judge ruled that Ed Gein was not of sound mind when he committed the crimes. Therefore, he was found not guilty by reason of insanity, and instead of being sent to prison, it was decided that he should be committed to a mental hospital once again. Although the judge's ruling mentioned the two murders committed by Ed Gein, he stated that due to the high cost of prosecution, a formal verdict was only handed down for the murder of Bernice Worden. Ed Gein had already clearly admitted to killing Mary Hogan. From this point on, Ed Gein began serving his sentence in a mental hospital for life. In the public conscience, he was undoubtedly guilty. However, legally, he was not a convict, but a mental patient undergoing treatment. After the trial, Gein's property and belongings were confiscated by the state. In 1958, while Gein's farmhouse and land were being put up for auction, the house was completely destroyed by a mysterious fire in March 1958. It was thought that someone might have deliberately set the house on fire. However, the cause of the fire was never officially determined. When the news of the fire reached Gein in prison, he reportedly shrugged indifferently and said, "Good riddance." Among the people, this fire seemed like an answer to those curious individuals who wanted to turn the town's cursed house into a museum and a memorial site. The people of Plainfield chose to remain silent spectators as their own shame quietly turned to ashes. The Ed Gein case is one of the most debated examples in criminology history regarding the relationship between mental illness and crime. When he was first arrested in 1957, a psychiatric evaluation diagnosed Gein with schizophrenia and also noted that he exhibited sexual deviance. Experts determined that he could not distinguish between reality and fantasy and was suffering from a severe psychotic disorder. Gein developed a complete obsession with issues related to his mother, distorting reality. A psychiatrist named Dr. Schubert, after interviewing Ed Gein, described him as a person with an abnormally strong attachment to his mother. This attachment was at the center of all Gein's actions. The trauma caused by his mother's death had sparked in Ed's mind an interest close to necrophilia, that is, sexual attraction to corpses. However, Ed Gein categorically denied having sexual intercourse with the corpses he had obtained. He rejected the allegations of necrophilia, saying they smelled terrible. In fact, his motivation was less about sexual pleasure and more about the fantasy of bringing his mother back. He confessed that he wanted to get under his mother's skin by sewing a woman's dress from the pieces of the women he killed and dug up from their graves. During the trial, Ed Gein's connection to other crimes was also scrutinized. He was suspected again for some people who disappeared in Wisconsin between 1947 and 1957. For example, cases such as 8-year-old Georgia Weckler and 15-year-old Evelyn Hartley. However, Gein claimed that he never harmed anyone who did not share similar characteristics with his mother, and polygraph tests supported this claim. Psychiatrists also reported that Gein's violence was directed only at female figures representing his mother, and that he was not dangerous otherwise. In a way, Ed Gein didn't quite fit the serial killer profile. He didn't commit murders one after another for sexual pleasure or a desire for power. Rather, he robbed graves and committed murder when the opportunity arose for his own sick purposes. During his years in the hospital, Ed Gein was under heavy medication and supervision, and he behaved calmly. Officials described him as a model patient, noting that he was obedient, polite, and helpful. Over the years, Gein became a forgotten name in society and withdrew into his own inner world. On July 26, 1984, at the age of 77, Ed Gein died at the Mendora Mental Health Institute due to respiratory failure and lung cancer. After his death, his body was buried next to his mother Augusta in Plainfield Cemetery, as per his will. Of course, the gravestone did not last long. Visitors and souvenir hunters stole the gravestone piece by piece, leaving Ed Gein's grave nameless for a while. The gravestone, which was completely stolen in 2000, was found in 2001 and taken to a police storage facility, never to be returned to its original location. Today it lies in an unmarked grave next to Ed Gein's mother. He left behind a chilling legacy. Ed's story left a deep mark on popular culture, inspiring countless films, TV series, books, and songs. His bizarre crimes reappeared time and again, especially in works of horror and suspense. The name Ed Gein may be unknown to many, but almost everyone recognizes the fictional characters shaped by his heinous acts. The first major impact came with Robert Bloch's 1959 thriller novel Psycho. Bloch drew inspiration from Ed Gein's life story to write about a killer obsessed with his mother. The character of Norman Bates in this novel directly evokes Ed Gein with his controlling mother figure and the dark secrets he hides in his home. Buffalo Bill is a serial killer who murders women and attempts to sew clothing from their skins. This obsession is a fictional reflection of Ed Gein's fixation on women's clothing. In fact, the Netflix series Monster, the Ed Gein story, set to premiere in 2025, dramatizes Ed Gein's life and tells his story. Ed Gein is the embodiment of the archetype of the real monster in modern culture. His case became one of the most extreme examples of how unimaginable darkness can lurk within a seemingly innocent person. Following him, the concept of serial killers began to be examined more closely in American society, and the question of what creates monsters began to be asked more deeply in the fields of psychiatry and criminology. In a sense, Ed Gein became one of history's most notorious criminals despite committing only 2 murders, and perhaps most disturbingly, his legacy lives on. Each new generation grows up seeing traces of his story in horror films or novels. The life of Plainfield Butcher Ed Gein left people with both real horror and the legends born from that horror, existing on that fine line where reality meets nightmare. We've reached the end of this video. See you next time. Take care.